Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today, we'll look into the darkest parts of the Appalachian Mountains, where the fog hides secrets that time has never been able to get rid of. In the middle of Kentucky, where mountains rise like guardians of forgotten stories, people don't say the name Abigail Hensley after dark. A woman who, according to records from Harlan County, turned 49 in 1897, but her life seemed to go against the grain of any normal timeline. There aren't many records about her because they were either burned on purpose or lost in strange fires that destroyed city records over the years. In the late 1800s, federal law barely reached the Appalachian region. In deep valleys and thick forests, people in isolated communities made their own rules and codes of silence. People who traveled disappeared all the time, but outside investigators started to notice a pattern that always led to a remote property on the slopes of Pine Mountain. Abigail was not your average mountain dweller. People knew her for letting travelers and merchants stay with her on the dangerous trails that connected Virginia and Tennessee. People who were afraid of spending the night in the mountains could find shelter in her log cabin, which was built on a bend in the old wagon road. But this safe place came with a cost that no one expected. The first rumors started when a fabric merchant from Lexington never made it to his destination. Then a medicine salesman and an itinerant preacher followed. Everyone had last been seen going toward that lonely piece of land. Families asked questions, but the answers were always the same. No one had seen or heard anything. The mountain's quietness kept its own safe. Abigail had a strange reputation. She had been a widow for a long time and ran a small inn by herself. It seemed to do well, even though it was far from the main trade routes. She sold food, cooked meals, and made beds. Her closest neighbors, who lived miles away, talked about how strong she was for someone who looked to be her age, and how the smell that sometimes came from her property when the wind blew from a certain direction was strange. A sheriff from another county looked into the disappearance of 3 men who had left different towns but were all taking the same route in 1898. They all had money and valuable things with them, and they all said they would stop at Hensley's Inn. The sheriff came alone one fall afternoon, when the ground was covered in golden leaves and the air was cold like it is in the mountains. What he saw on that trip would change how people remembered that area forever. At first glance, the cabin looked normal. The wood was dark from age, smoke was slowly coming out of the chimney, and chickens were pecking in the yard. Abigail welcomed him like the mountain people do, offering him coffee and bread. But there was something hard in her eyes that didn't match her kind actions. The sheriff, who was good at reading people, felt the weight of that look. It was the look of someone who kept secrets as deep as the valleys around them. He brought up the disappearances in a casual way during their first conversation and watched how each person reacted. Abigail stayed calm and said that a lot of people traveled through there, that the mountains were dangerous, and that wild animals and cliffs took their toll. It sounded like she had practiced those words a lot because her voice was strong, almost robotic. The sheriff asked if he could look at the property. She thought about it for a second before saying yes, but that was enough time to confirm her suspicions. There was a heavy padlock on the barn in the back. Abigail said that was where she kept her winter food, which animals often tried to steal. She finally opened the door when the sheriff told her to. The smell that came out was beyond words, a mix of decay and something else, something that had been processed. He found personal items like watches, wallets, and clothes that didn't belong to a mountain woman among the barrels and sacks. And then, in a dark corner, something that made his blood run cold. Years later, official records of what happened in that barn were lost, but bits of evidence still exist in the personal letters and diaries of people who lived there. Reports say that the sheriff left that property with a pale face and shaking hands. He rode straight to the nearest town and got a group of men to come back with him. But when they came back 3 days later, the cabin was empty. Abigail had disappeared like smoke in the mist on the mountain. She left behind only signs of a life that seemed to have been carefully planned for a bad reason. The property was searched very carefully. There were more personal items buried in different parts of the grounds, some of which were years old. Each new find made it more and more clear how many travelers had gone that way and never been seen again. Through the things that were found, investigators were able to find family members of some of the victims. A family in Ohio is looking for a loved one who went missing in 1895 because they found a pocket watch with engraved initials. A widow in Tennessee recognized a Bible with notes in the margins. Each object stood for a life that was cut short, a story that ended suddenly in those mountains. There was never a clear answer to how many people went missing, but conservative estimates said that at least a dozen people went missing in that area. It took months to find Abigail Hensley. They put up posters with her picture in nearby counties, but the Appalachian Mountains were so big and full of places to hide that no one could find her. Some theories said she had helpers who helped her get away using trails that only people from that area knew about. Others talked about a larger network of other isolated inns that were running the same kind of scheme along trade routes. Her past made the case even more interesting. Investigators who looked into it more closely found out that Abigail had moved to that area from another state around 1880. Before that, it was hard to follow her. Some papers said that she might have used different names in different places. There were reports of a woman who looked a lot like this one being involved in strange events in West Virginia years ago, but there was never any solid proof. When the locals finally spoke up, they told things they had been too scared or loyal to say before. They talked about nights when they heard screams coming from that direction, but they thought they were just wild animals. Of how Abigail always had money to buy things, even though the inn was her only source of income and there weren't many guests there. Of her strange physical strength and how she could carry heavy bags by herself that would take 2 men to carry. A former postal worker told us one thing that really bothered us. He remembered that Abigail got mail from different cities, and the names on the envelopes were always different. One time when she was asked about this, she said that she took care of mail for travelers who stayed at her property, but they never picked up the letters. They just showed up and left, which makes it seem like she might have been using the victims' own identities for something even worse. In the spring of 1899, an unexpected clue came to light. A rag picker who worked in the mountains to the south said they saw a woman who looked like Abigail in a small village near the North Carolina border. She was going by a different name and ran a small boarding house for minors. When the police got there to look into it, she was gone again, leaving behind only rumors and more questions that weren't answered. This pattern would happen again and again over the next few years. Reports of sightings, investigations that took too long, and the same result every time. She was one step ahead. It was as if she had a strong sense of danger, a way to tell what people were going to do before they did it. Or maybe she had informants who told her when investigators were coming. Abigail knew how to use the fact that the mountains protect their own to her advantage. When investigators found a pattern in Abigail Hensley's methods, the mystery surrounding her became even stranger. She didn't pick her victims at random. She picked them very carefully, almost like a plan. Men who traveled alone and didn't have close family waiting for them. Merchants whose routes were always changing and hard to predict. People who would be missing for months and no one would look for them, if anyone even did. A journalist from Louisville decided to look into the case on his own in 1901 because he was interested in the stories going around about the mountain woman. He spent weeks talking to people who had lived there for a long time, putting together bits of information that the authorities had missed. He wrote a series of articles about what he found that caused a stir at the time, but many of the details were thought to be too sensational to be published in full. The journalist discovered an interesting pattern in geography. At least 5 different states had seen similar disappearances over the course of 20 years. They always happened in remote mountainous areas and involved lodges run by single women. The descriptions were a little different, but there were enough similarities to suggest that it could be the same person or a group of people using the same methods. The idea that Abigail might not have been working alone started to gain ground. Records from Harland County showed something that had not been noticed before. Before opening her inn, Abigail worked as a cook in different lumber camps. She knew the trade routes, how travelers moved, and when the roads were busiest. It wasn't an accident that they knew this. They had been watching, learning, and planning for years. Every part of her operation showed that she was smart and cold-blooded. One thing that really bothered me was how she seemed to be able to control people. People who stayed at her inn and didn't become victims said she was a charming woman who could make any tired traveler feel safe and at home. She told local stories, made jokes at the right time, and gave advice on the best ways to get places. She was the best host ever, until she wasn't anymore. Some accounts that were not complete suggested that she first used subtle methods. She gave her guests drinks that made them fall into a deep sleep. She made these drinks herself with herbs from the mountains, and she may have learned how to do this from the natives or by trying things out over the years. It was too late by the time her victims woke up, if they did at all. They were alone, confused, and completely under her control. The people who lived near her old house had to deal with the effects of the discovery. People who had lived next door to Abigail for years were shocked that they hadn't seen anything. Some people said they had suspicions, but the mountain code of silence, respect for others' privacy, and maybe even a natural fear had kept everyone quiet. Now that silence felt like a heavy burden of shared guilt. Authorities looked into records of similar hosts in the Appalachian region as part of the investigation. What they found was very scary. In the past few years, 3 other businesses run by single women have suddenly closed down, leaving behind disturbing evidence. But it was impossible to connect these cases for sure without arrests or confessions. The only thing that was certain was that something much bigger was going on in the mountain's shadows. There was a story from a survivor in 1902. A man said he got away from Abigail after figuring out what she wanted. He told the story of how he got to the inn at night, tired from days of travel. She was very nice to him and told him to eat and sleep, but something about the way she acted made him uneasy. Maybe it was the way she looked at his things for a long time, or the way she locked the doors more carefully than usual. When she gave him a hot drink, he acted like he was drinking it, but when she wasn't looking, he spilled it. When she came back hours later to see if he was asleep, he was still breathing normally and keeping his eyes closed. He heard her moving around the cabin, dragging something heavy, the sound of metal hitting wood, and footsteps coming down from somewhere below the floor. He waited until it was quiet again. Then he ran out of the bedroom window, leaving everything behind. This testimony, which we can't fully confirm, added to the mystery. It made it seem like there was something below the cabin, maybe a basement or an underground passage, where Abigail hid what she was doing. When investigators went back to the original property to look for it, they saw signs that the floor had been changed recently, but any proof had been taken away or destroyed before she got away. Some investigators became obsessed with finding Abigail Hensley. They saw her as not only a criminal, but also as a puzzle that went against everything they knew about how people act. How could a 49-year-old woman keep running an operation in dangerous territory for so long without being caught? The answer was in the Appalachian Mountains' geography and culture. That area was very different from the rest of the world at the start of the 20th century. People who lived in communities separated by deep valleys came up with their own dialects and ways of doing things. People in the mountains didn't like the federal government getting involved in their business. They thought it was an outside intrusion. Someone as smart as Abigail could do well in this world, moving between communities that didn't talk to each other and changing who they were as needed. People and situations were something she was very good at reading, which is something that people often forget. People who knew her said she was very smart and could remember small details from casual conversations. She could tell if a traveler had money by how he held his bag. She knew routes and schedules better than any cartographer. She understood the rhythm of the seasons and how they affected the flow of people on the roads. Her best weapon was this knowledge. Bank records from nearby towns showed some interesting transactions. A woman who looked like Abigail made deposits in small amounts that didn't draw attention, always using different names. She converted her victims' assets into cash through intermediaries, selling items in distant markets where no one would ask inconvenient questions. It was a sophisticated system that demonstrated long-term planning. The theory that she might have had accomplices gained traction when investigators discovered suspicious correspondence. Letters exchanged between different counties, written in coded language, mentioned goods and deliveries in a way that suggested something beyond legitimate commerce. Some of these letters were intercepted, but their authorship could never be definitively confirmed. There were several places where the paper had been burned, as if someone had tried to get rid of evidence but only partially succeeded. There was a confirmed sighting in 1903. A deputy saw her at a train station in West Virginia, but she disappeared into the crowd before he could get to her. This incident proved that she was still in the area, moving with surprising boldness despite the hunt. Perhaps she relied too much on her ability to change her appearance, or perhaps she simply had nowhere else to go. She knew every trail and hiding place in the mountains because they were her home. The psychology behind her actions intrigued scholars of the time. How does someone develop such a capacity for calculated violence? Some speculated about past traumas that might have shaped her personality. Others suggested that she simply saw her victims as resources, not as people. This emotional coldness, combined with superior intelligence, created a dangerous combination that defied known criminal standards. Families of the victims began to organize, pressuring authorities for results. Some offered rewards for Abigail's capture, but this had unexpected consequences. Inexperienced bounty hunters flooded the mountains, scaring away potential informants and hindering legitimate investigations. There were cases of innocent women being falsely accused simply because they vaguely matched the description or lived in isolation. The media at the time helped to make the case seem like a myth. Sensationalist newspapers published dramatic illustrations and exaggerated stories that had little basis in reality. This got people interested and spread false information, which made it harder to tell what was true and what wasn't. Some articles made her out to be a kind of mountain witch who used magic. Some people said she was a victim of circumstances who had to commit crimes to survive. The truth, as always, was probably more complex and disturbing than any simplified narrative. Abigail Hensley was a product of her time and place, but she was also something unique. A criminal mind operating with business efficiency in a period where communication between authorities was slow and records were easily falsified or destroyed. She exploited the weaknesses of a system that was still learning how to deal with organized crime. As the years passed, sightings became rarer. Some believed she had died, perhaps of natural causes or in an accident on the treacherous trail she knew so well. Others said she had just learned how to hide better and adapt to the new realities of a country that was slowly becoming more modern. The mountains guarded her secret, as they guarded so many others. The winter of 1904 brought an unexpected twist to the investigation. A former friend of Abigail's, either out of guilt or fear of being involved, went to the police with information that changed the whole case. He revealed that Abigail was not merely an isolated opportunist, but part of an informal network operating along the Appalachian trade routes. This network didn't have a set structure, but they all shared information and ways of doing things. According to this testimony, there were established communication points, markings on specific trees, messages left in taverns and small towns, signaling systems that indicated when the authorities were nearby or when new, vulnerable travelers were on their way. It wasn't a criminal organization in the traditional sense, but rather sporadic cooperation between individuals who shared similar interests and protected each other through silence. This revelation completely changed the scope of the investigation. They weren't just going after one person anymore. They were trying to break up a whole culture of predation that had grown up in the remote mountain areas. The issue was that this culture was very old and came from years of being alone and not trusting outside authorities. Breaking the code of silence would require not only police force but profound social change. Investigators began mapping the geography of crime in the Appalachians. They identified at least 8 locations where similar patterns of disappearances had been documented over 30 years. Some of these places were inns, others were taverns, some were simply isolated properties where travelers were last seen. Each location shared characteristics: extreme isolation, management by solitary individuals, proximity to poorly guarded trade routes. What set Abigail apart from the others was her longevity and success. While many had been captured or forced to flee after only a few years, she maintained her operation for nearly 2 decades. This not only suggested luck, but also that they were very good at not being found. She understood when it was time to move, how to cover her tracks, which authorities were competent, and which could be avoided or deceived. The financial records revealed an interesting fact. Abigail had put some of her illegally gained money into real estate under fake names. These included small plots of land in different counties and some commercial buildings in remote villages. It was like she was making a web of places to hide and ways to make money on the side, getting ready for a time when she would have to completely disappear. This foresight demonstrated a mind that thought years ahead. The stories told by those who knew her painted a contradictory portrait. Some people remembered her as kind and helpful to her neighbors, giving them food during the cold winters. Others described her as distant and calculating, someone who maintained relationships only as long as they were useful. This duality made it difficult to understand her true nature. Was it a social mask or real human complexity? A controversial theory came out in 1905. A psychiatrist from an Eastern university who was very interested in the case said that Abigail might have a condition that made it hard for her to feel normal empathy. According to him, she saw other people as objects to be used, not as beings with lives and feelings of their own. This perspective was radical for the time, when criminal behavior was generally attributed to simple moral wickedness or demonic influences. The theory faced opposition, yet it also initiated dialogues regarding the essence of crime and accountability. If someone couldn't feel empathy because of a neurological problem, did that change how guilty they were? The courts weren't ready to handle such deep philosophical issues. The legal system worked on the basis of whether someone was guilty or innocent, sane or insane. There wasn't much room for psychological subtleties that modern science was just starting to look into. While educated people in the city were having heated debates, the search went on in the mountains. They hired experienced trackers who knew the trails as well as Abigail did. They followed leads that didn't pan out, talked to locals who didn't want to talk to them, and made maps of places where she might be hiding. It was slow and dangerous work to cross rough terrain in all kinds of weather, always one step behind someone who knew that area better than anyone else. One tracker, who had been working in the area for 30 years, got very close. He found evidence of recent use in an abandoned cabin near the Tennessee border, such as warm campfire remains and signs of people being there. But the next day, when he came back with more troops, the place was empty again. There were only a few signs that someone had been there, and they had taken everything with them. In 1906, investigators changed their strategy because they were getting more and more frustrated. Instead of going after Abigail directly, the authorities decided to focus on taking down the systems that helped her. They started looking into merchants who might be buying stolen goods, financial middlemen who helped her make deals, and people in the area who stayed quiet about what she was doing because they were scared or had a twisted sense of loyalty. This new method showed a complicated web of unintentional involvement. Over the years, a lot of people had talked to Abigail without really understanding what she was. A blacksmith who sold her tools, a farmer who sometimes traded food, and a seamstress who made custom clothes. Each of these people gave her small pieces of a bigger puzzle that helped her business run smoothly, even though they didn't always understand the whole thing. What these investigations showed was a picture of how crime can grow in places where people don't ask questions and look away. People didn't really support what Abigail was doing. They just didn't want to know. This intentional blindness was their own way of staying safe and going on with their lives without having to deal with upsetting truths. The mountains taught the people who lived there to mind their own business and not bother other people. Finally, a merchant in Louisville admitted that over the years, he had bought a lot of valuable things from a woman who looked like Abigail. These included pocket watches, rings, rare coins, and small musical instruments. He said he didn't suspect anything at first, but he later admitted that he started to doubt where all the valuable goods were coming from when they came from someone who looked like a simple mountain dweller. Still, the easy money was more important to him than his conscience. This merchant gave rough dates for the transactions, which helped to make a timeline of Abigail's actions. The data showed that she worked in cycles, with months of seeming inactivity followed by periods of intense activity. This was in line with how people traveled in the mountains during the seasons. More people traveled in the spring and fall, which made those times riskier and more likely to be good. When winters were very cold and summers were very hot, there were fewer cars on the road. She had to either hibernate or move. By looking at these patterns, the investigators were able to guess where she might show up next. They found a number of properties that fit her operational profile. They were isolated, but not impossible to get to, close to trade routes, and in places where local governments were weak or corrupt. Some of these places had teams quietly waiting for any sign of her presence. At the same time, Abigail's story started to spread beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The ghost woman of the mountains became almost legendary when newspapers in big cities wrote about her. This had both good and bad effects. It put more pressure on local authorities to solve the case, though. But it also made it harder to tell what was true and what was not by creating an aura around her. Each time the story was told, new details were added, making it harder to tell the truth from the legend. There was a big breakthrough in August 1907. A woman was taken into custody in a small town in southwest Virginia on suspicion of fraud. She tried to sell a set of rare coins that she said were family heirlooms using fake documents. The coins looked like things that had been stolen from one of Abigail's known victims. When asked, the woman first denied any connection, but as the pressure grew, she admitted that she had gotten the coins from someone else years before. The way she described Abigail Hensley was exactly right. More importantly, she told us something very important. Abigail had talked about moving to a place that was even more remote, maybe the mountains of North Carolina, where the government was almost non-existent and communities lived almost completely on their own. It was a real clue after years of searching in vain. Scientists set up an expedition to that area. They traveled for weeks through deep valleys and steep ridges, stopping in settlements that weren't even on official maps. People who lived in these areas didn't trust strangers, especially those who worked for the government. Many doors stayed shut, and many questions were met with angry silence. To get into this isolated world, you needed more than just determination. You also needed diplomacy and endless patience. An old local finally gave us useful information. He remembered a woman who had come to the area a few years before and bought an abandoned house on the higher slopes. She stayed away from other people and only came out to buy basic supplies now and then. She never stayed to talk and always paid in cash. He said there was something about her that made people not want to ask questions. She had an air of quiet authority and something else that made people instinctively stay away. The most direct trail to the property took 2 days to ride. It would take longer if you wanted to stay hidden. It was in a place called Devil's Ridge, which is a fittingly creepy name for a place where the valleys were always shrouded in fog and the sunlight was blocked by old trees even in the middle of the day. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted to completely leave society, a place where the modern world had not yet come and might never come. The investigators planned to be very careful. They didn't want to tell her too soon and risk another escape. They hired local guides who knew hidden trails that would let them get around the property without being seen. It took them weeks to get ready. They looked at the terrain, made maps of possible escape routes, and thought about every possible outcome. They were dealing with someone who had been able to avoid capture for almost 10 years. If they didn't take her seriously, the operation would fail. Finally, at the end of October 1907, the team was ready. The leaves on the trees turned the mountains red and gold. They left before dawn and moved quietly through the thick woods. The air was very cold, like it is at high altitudes, and their breaths made little clouds of vapor. They planned every move and avoided making any noise. They had not only weapons with them, but also legal warrants and chains. This time, they were determined to keep her from getting away. When they got to the clearing where the cabin was, the sun was just starting to rise, and the morning mist made the rays look golden. The structure was small and made of logs that had darkened over time. It was almost impossible to see among the trees around it. The chimney let out a lazy stream of smoke, which meant that people were there. Finally, the moment they had been waiting for had come. They thought the hunt was almost over. The investigators quietly surrounded the property, making sure to place themselves at every possible escape route. William Crawford, a seasoned marshal who was in charge of the operation, watched the cabin for a long time before giving any orders. He had chased criminals all over the region for 20 years, but he said that this case was different. He was very upset by Abigail's determination and ability to stay one step ahead all the time. The smoke coming from the chimney was a comforting sign of normalcy that stood in stark contrast to the tension of the moment. Crawford waved his hand, and 3 men moved toward the front door. Other men stayed where they were to cover the windows and the back of the property. In the quiet of the morning, the sound of boots crushing dry leaves seemed very loud. Birds that had been singing in the morning stopped all of a sudden, as if they knew something big was about to happen. There was no answer right away when they knocked on the door. Crawford told them to show their authority and told whoever was inside to come out peacefully. There were a lot of things that could happen after the silence. It felt like seconds lasted forever. Finally, after what seemed like a long time of thinking, the door slowly opened, and a person stepped out who would change their understanding of the case forever. The woman who came out of the cabin was at least 60 years old, maybe even older. Her face showed years of hard living in the mountains, with deep wrinkles around her eyes that had seen many harsh winters. Her clothes were worn and simple, but there was something in her eyes, a sharp and calculating intelligence that confirmed Crawford's suspicions right away. There was no doubt that this was Abigail Hensley, but she looked more worn than the description said. She didn't try to run away or fight back when she was arrested. She just held her wrists out to the handcuffs with a look of tired acceptance, as if she knew this moment would come and had made peace with how inevitable it was. When she finally spoke, her voice was surprisingly calm and polite. She asked if it was okay to put out the fire and lock her property up properly. The request was so ordinary and routine that the investigators almost forgot who they were holding for a moment. And they found what looked like a normal life when they searched the cabin. There were things for the winter, tools for work, and some books that had been used a lot and were worn out. There were no clear signs of crime, like a hiding place full of stolen goods or evidence that could be used against them. It was like she had finally quit her old life and was trying to live her last years in peace and quiet. But then they found something in a hidden space under the floorboards that changed everything. There were pages and pages of small, neat handwriting in the diary, which recorded years of activities in such detail that it would make any researcher shudder. Abigail had written down everything: names, dates, amounts of money, and descriptions of things. It wasn't clear if it was pride, a need for order, or a mental urge to remember what she did. It was clear that this diary was a full confession and a map of crimes that had happened over the course of more than 20 years. It took 4 days to get back to civilization. Abigail didn't say anything for most of the trip. She was on a horse between armed guards, crossing the same mountains that had been her kingdom for so long. She sometimes looked at the distant ridges with a look that could be seen as nostalgia or regret. Crawford tried to talk to her a few times because he was curious about what made her tick, but she just looked away and stayed quiet. A crowd was already waiting for them when they finally got to Asheville, North Carolina. Telegraphs and messengers quickly spread the news of the capture. People came from faraway counties to see the woman who had been the subject of so many stories. There were family members of the victims there, their faces showing years of unresolved grief. There were people who were just interested in the case because it was famous, and there were a lot of journalists who wanted to know every little thing about a story that would sell newspapers for months. While prosecutors started the long process of building a case against Abigail, she was kept in a cell that had been specially prepared for her. There was a lot of evidence in the diary, but they still needed to back it up with physical evidence and testimony. People looked for things described in the diary in pawn shops and private collections, and they talked to the families of the victims. It was a huge puzzle that took months of careful work to solve. During this time, Abigail started to talk, but not in a formal confession or show of remorse. Instead, she had short conversations with guards, and sometimes with Marshal Crawford, who became almost academically interested in her psychology. She talked about the mountains and how she had learned to live on her own after her husband died, leaving her poor in a place that didn't forgive weakness. She told me about the first traveler who came to her property and had more money than she would see in years of hard work. When she talked about that first important moment, her story didn't have any emotion. She had offered to take care of her, which was common in the mountains. He had slept in her cabin, trusting that strangers would be nice to him, and she had stayed up all night staring at his bag of money and thinking about how much it would change her life. She said that the decision came from a place of cold pragmatism, not malice. He had something she wanted, and the mountains were big enough to keep secrets. She said it got easier after that first time, not because she liked violence, but because she saw those actions as necessary for survival, just like hunting animals for food. It was a way for her to keep going while still feeling like she was separate from what she was doing. She didn't think of herself as a monster. She thought of herself as a survivor who did what she had to do in a world that didn't offer women alone with few resources any other options. Crawford was upset by these talks because of how coldly she talked about horrible things and how little she cared about the victims. He felt like he was looking into a moral abyss he didn't know was there. He had dealt with murderers before, men who were angry, greedy, or passionate. But Abigail was different. She had turned crime into a profession, maintaining an emotional detachment that allowed her to continue year after year without apparent psychological torment. In January 1908, work began on getting ready for the trial. Prosecutors chose to start with 3 cases where the evidence was strongest, leaving the others for later trials if they were needed. The chosen victims were men whose families had been found and were willing to testify. Their belongings, which were described in the diary, had been found and could be used as physical evidence. It was a planned move to make sure the first trial ended in a conviction. A local lawyer took on Abigail's defense, but they did it more out of duty than because they believed in her. He would say that she was temporarily insane because years of being alone and having a hard time in the mountains had hurt her mind. It wasn't a strong defense, especially since her diary showed how carefully she planned everything, but it was the only choice she had. No jury would agree with arguments of economic necessity when it came to multiple planned murders. The legal system moved slowly, but Abigail kept talking to Crawford from time to time. She talked about the mountains with a kind of real love, saying that she knew every trail, spring, and cave that could keep her safe during storms. The mountains were where she lived, where she fought, and where she worked. She understood them in a way that few others did, respecting their power and beauty while also using them for bad things. During one of those talks, she said something that Crawford would always remember. She said that mountains didn't judge, didn't ask questions about the past or intentions. They just were there, not caring about the human drama going on around them. She said that this lack of concern was freeing. It let people be who they wanted to be without having to worry about what others thought or what was right or wrong. It was a scary way of thinking coming from someone who had done terrible things with that freedom. The trial of Abigail Hensley started on a cold March morning in 1908 at the Buncombe County Courthouse. The room was so full that people were waiting in the hallways and outside the building for any news about what was going on. Journalists from all over the country had come to cover what was already being called the trial of the century in Appalachia. The mood was tense and full of morbid curiosity that could be felt in every whispered conversation. 2 guards led Abigail into the room. She was wearing a simple dress that had been given to her. Her hands were shackled, but she walked with surprising grace, keeping her head up and her eyes straight ahead. She didn't seem nervous at all. She didn't shake or try to avoid the crowd's stares. It was like she was watching the trial from the outside, with a distant interest in what was going on. The newspapers that would fill the pages of magazines in the weeks to come would often talk about this calmness. The prosecutor was a man named Theodore Blackwell, who was known for being able to make strong arguments and speak well. He had spent months getting ready for the case, going over every diary entry, talking to witnesses, and putting together a story that would show that he was guilty on purpose. He began his speech by describing a woman who had turned traditional mountain hospitality into a deadly trap by taking advantage of the trust of weak travelers, which was against the most sacred rules of that culture. Blackwell's plan was well thought out. He started by making a timeline that showed how disappearances had happened in a regular way over the years, always close to Abigail's original property. He brought detailed maps showing the paths the victims had taken, all of which led to that one spot in the mountains. He called witnesses who had seen the missing men last and found that they were alive and well when they passed through that area. They were carrying valuable things that Abigail would later have. The first testimony that really made a difference came from a widow from Cincinnati, whose husband had died 15 years before. He sold spices and traveled the Appalachian roads a lot. He just disappeared on one of these trips in 1893. She had been looking for years, spending her savings and hiring private detectives, but nothing worked. Now, as proof, his pocket watch, which had his initials on it, was found among the things that Abigail had written about in her diary. The woman cried in the witness box not only because she had confirmed her husband's death, but also because she finally had closure after so much painful uncertainty. The prosecution's main piece of evidence was Abigail's diary. Blackwell read aloud some of the entries, which were written with almost businesslike accuracy. Dates, amounts of money, descriptions of objects, and everything else was recorded with disturbing clarity. There was no emotional language in the entries, and there was no sign of doubt or conflict. They were just records of transactions, like she was keeping track of sales in a store instead of actions that had broken up families and cut lives short. The defense tried to say that the diary could mean something else, like that Abigail was just writing down things she had bought from travelers. But Blackwell quickly disproved this claim by showing that many of the items on the list had been reported as belonging to missing people, and that the dates in the diary matched up perfectly with the last known sightings of these people. There was no doubt about the connection. The circumstantial evidence was so strong that it was almost a direct confession. Abigail stayed calm during the whole trial. She didn't show any emotion while listening to the testimonies, not even when family members of the victims talked about how the disappearances had ruined their lives. Psychologists who watched the trial said that this lack of emotional response was typical of someone who has very little ability to empathize. It seemed like she didn't understand how much pain she had caused, or she just didn't care. Both options were equally scary. The defense only called a few witnesses, mostly neighbors who had known Abigail for a long time and said she had always been polite and hard-working and had never shown any signs of violence or instability. A doctor from the area testified about how hard it is for single women to live in the mountains, trying to put her actions in a context that would explain, if not justify them. But these arguments didn't seem very strong when compared to the amount of evidence the prosecution gave. The jury, which was made up of 12 men from the area, paid close attention, but their faces showed that they had already made up their minds. Something surprising happened on the fourth day of the trial. Abigail's lawyer strongly advised her not to testify in her own defense, but she did anyway. Everyone in the room stopped talking when she got on the stand. Everyone wanted to hear her explain her actions in her own words. What happened next was one of the most amazing things to happen in the history of the courts in that area. It was a look into a mind that worked on ideas that were very different from what society thought was right. Abigail spoke clearly and firmly while under oath. She didn't deny what the prosecution said. Instead, she put her actions in the context of a survival philosophy she had developed over decades of living alone. She talked about how she had been left with nothing after her husband's death, and how society didn't really offer any options for women in her situation. She talked about the first traveler she met, who was carrying money that represented years of honest work. She also talked about how, at that moment, she made a conscious choice that her survival was more important than the moral rules that society had put in place but had abandoned her. Her story made sense, but it didn't have any moral value. She didn't ask for forgiveness. Instead, she asked for people to understand that she had lived by different rules, the rules of the mountains, where strength and cunning decided who lived and who died. She didn't think of herself as a criminal. She thought of herself as a practical person who saw an opportunity and took advantage of it without feeling guilty, like civilized society wanted her to. It was a defense that didn't accept the laws that judged her as real, which was a basic rejection of the social contract that kept communities together. Blackwell's cross-examination was very hard. He made her face each victim directly, say their names, and admit that they were real people with families who loved them and were waiting for them to come home. But Abigail stuck to her philosophical beliefs, even when things got really bad. She knew these were people on an intellectual level, but she couldn't seem to process it emotionally in a way that would make her feel real guilt. To her, they were still just ideas, chances she had taken, not real people whose lives had been cut short too soon. When Blackwell asked her directly if she felt any regret, she thought about the question for a long time before answering with disturbing honesty. She said she was sorry for being caught, but she would still rather be living peacefully in her mountain cabin. As for the acts themselves, no, she didn't feel sorry in the way he was suggesting. She had made those choices based on the situation at the time, and she would do the same thing again if she were in the same situation. The confession shocked even the most jaded people who were watching the trial. The jury took less than 3 hours to make a decision. The foreman read the verdict out loud when they got back, and his voice echoed through the quiet room. Guilty on all counts. Abigail didn't change her expression. She just nodded slightly, as if to say that she already knew what was going to happen. A week later, the sentence would be given, but everyone already knew what it would be. When there were multiple planned murders, especially if they were done for financial gain or other reasons, the law at the time only allowed for one punishment. As they led Abigail out of the room, she looked out the windows one last time at the mountains in the distance. The wildflowers that covered the slopes in the spring made the landscape look bright and colorful. She seemed to take in the view and remember it. One of the guards said later that she had said something at that moment that he couldn't fully understand, but sounded like a goodbye. The mountains had been her home, her safe place, and her kingdom. Now she could only see them from a distance, through iron bars. There were a lot of arguments all over the country about the trial's media coverage. Some people said that the case showed how society treats widowed women badly, making them more likely to feel hopeless and make bad decisions. Some people thought Abigail was just evil, showing that some people are born without the moral compass that most people have. Psychologists argued about nature versus nurture, asking if circumstances could turn a normal person into a predator, or if she had always had that ability waiting for the right time to show itself. A few days after the verdict, Marshal Crawford, who had spent so much time trying to catch her, went to see Abigail in her cell. He was still looking for answers, trying to figure out why the human mind worked so differently from the way it usually does. She talked to him honestly, and it seemed like she liked that he was interested in learning more than that he was judging her morals. She said that people always look for complicated reasons for behaviors they think are strange, but sometimes the truth is simple. She had found a way to stay alive and do well, and she followed that path with the same determination that others show when they work hard. After that last talk, Crawford felt upset in ways he couldn't fully explain. He had caught the criminal and seen justice done, but he didn't feel the same sense of satisfaction that usually comes with solving a tough case. Instead, he had to deal with uncomfortable questions about human nature, the fine line between civilization and savagery, and how many other people might be living by the same rules in remote parts of the country where the law didn't reach. On a gray April morning in 1908, when the mountains were covered in low clouds and the city was getting a light rain, the sentence was read. Judge Harold Morrison had been on the bench for 30 years and had dealt with many hard cases, but he said this one hit him especially hard. He gave a speech before handing down the sentence that would be printed in newspapers all over the country. In it, he talked about Abigail's crimes and what they showed about society and human nature. Morrison talked about how the Appalachian Mountains have long been a place where federal law didn't always apply. Communities there made their own rules that didn't always follow the law. He understood how hard it was for people to live in extreme isolation, and how the need to survive could make people make desperate choices. But then his voice got stronger, making it clear that there was no situation, no matter how bad, that could justify what Abigail had done over the years in a planned and systematic way. The judge especially pointed out how clearly planned each act was, how she had set up an entire operational infrastructure, kept detailed records, and kept going year after year without showing any sign of wanting to stop or change course. He contended that this was not an act of desperate survival, but a deliberate and recurrent decision to prioritize her well-being over the lives of others. It was a basic rejection of the rules that let people live together in society, so the law should have given it the worst punishment possible. Morrison gave her the death penalty by hanging, and the execution was set to happen 6 months after all appeals had been heard. As he said the last words, the room stayed completely quiet. Abigail heard her sentence with the same calmness she had shown during the trial, without crying or complaining. She just nodded a little, as if she understood that the result was the logical end of an equation she had started to solve many years ago in the lonely mountains of Kentucky. The defense lawyers quickly filed appeals, which is what they usually do in death penalty cases. They said that the case got so much attention that the jury was swayed by sensationalist news coverage, which meant that she didn't get a fair trial. They also said that she should have been declared insane because she couldn't tell right from wrong in a way that would make her guilty of a crime. But these arguments ran into a big problem. Abigail's own diary made it clear that she fully understood what she was doing and had gone to great lengths to avoid being caught. Abigail stayed in a special cell in the county jail while the appeals process went through the courts. She had visitors from time to time, mostly journalists who wanted to talk to her for articles that were getting more and more sensational. Some people said she was a victim of her circumstances, a woman who society let down and then turned against it. Others portrayed her as a natural monster, proof that real evil exists in the world no matter what the social or economic situation is. A psychiatrist from the University of Virginia got permission to talk to her a lot in order to write a case study about her mental health. For weeks, he held long sessions in which Abigail talked about her life, her reasons for doing things, and her ideas about right and wrong. These meetings revealed a complicated picture of someone who was very smart, very good at planning, but completely lacking in emotional empathy. She could understand on an intellectual level that what she did caused pain, but this knowledge didn't make her feel the right way. The psychiatrist thought that Abigail was an example of a condition that science was just starting to figure out, a brain that was missing or damaged in a way that made it hard to tell right from wrong. She wasn't crazy in the usual way. She didn't have delusions or lose touch with reality. Instead, she had a different set of basic priorities, with self-interest being the most important value, without any concern for how her actions would affect others. It was a disturbing discovery that called into question what we thought we knew about free will and criminal responsibility. Abigail asked for paper and a pen while she was in jail. She started writing what she called a full memoir of her life. The authorities let this happen in the hopes that the document would help solve cases that were still open or clear up any questions that were still unanswered. Over the course of months, she wrote an amazing manuscript that gave readers an unprecedented look into her thoughts and methods. It was written with a level of clarity and detail that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Abigail wrote about her life from the early years of her marriage to the events that led to her capture in these memoirs. She wrote about how she and her husband, a merchant who wanted to start a successful business on the new trade routes in the Appalachians, had moved to the mountains. She said that he died in an accident a few years later, leaving her with no money in a dangerous place. And then, with brutal honesty, she wrote down that first decision that would change her life forever. She said that the first traveler had almost come by accident. He came looking for shelter one stormy night. She made room for him, cooked him a meal, and gave him a place to sleep. She couldn't sleep at night because she was always worried about money. She saw his bag full of gold coins. She wrote that it was at that moment that she understood how pointless honest work was compared to the chance that fate had given her. The choice was not made because of feelings, but because of a careful weighing of the costs and benefits of different options. After that first incident, she said she was very anxious and thought she would be found at any moment. But weeks turned into months, and no one came to ask questions. The traveler was a loner with no close family, which meant that no one would have looked for them right away if they had gone missing. She realized that there were a lot of people like this in the mountains, people who were just passing through and didn't have strong ties to anyone who would quickly notice they were gone. She had found a systemic weakness that could be used by accident. The memoirs explained how she then organized her work. She studied how people traveled, learned how to spot travelers who were weak, and came up with ways to make sure she never left any obvious clues. She made friends with dishonest merchants who would buy stolen goods without asking questions. She made up different names to use for different transactions. It was a criminal business that ran like a well-oiled machine, with every detail planned and carried out. The manuscript was especially useful to investigators because it was honest about numbers. Abigail gave estimates of how many victims there had been over the years, but she admitted that her first diary didn't include everything, especially from the early years when she wasn't as good at keeping records. The numbers she gave were much higher than what investigators had thought, which means that the full extent of her crimes may never be known. Every number stood for a life cut short, a family torn apart, and a future stolen. She also talked about the real-world problems of running such a business for so long. There were times when they almost caught me, and I had to think quickly and sometimes move suddenly. She always had to be on the lookout for threats or chances in every person she met. It was a life of constant stress, and letting your guard down, even for a second, could mean the end of everything. But she described this tension almost nostalgically, as if they were her most vital and engaged years. One particularly intriguing aspect of the memoirs was her reflection on morality. Abigail devoted several pages to exploring why she didn't feel guilt in the way that presumably other people would. She theorized that all humans fundamentally operated out of self-interest, but most had been conditioned by society to disguise this under layers of artificial morality. She had simply removed those layers, operating with brutal honesty about her own motivations. It was a nihilistic philosophy that said human life has no value in and of itself, only what it means to the person. The guards who were in charge of her had different ideas about her. Some saw her as evil incarnate, avoiding interaction beyond the absolutely necessary. Others were curiously fascinated, occasionally conversing with her about mundane topics. Abigail was polite to everyone, never causing trouble, and meticulously following prison rules. She was a model prisoner, which created a disturbing cognitive dissonance between her present behavior and the terrible crimes for which she had been convicted. In July 1908, the appeals court rejected all appeals filed by the defense. They upheld the original conviction and maintained the death sentence. The execution was rescheduled for September of the same year. When Abigail received the news, she asked for only one thing: to be allowed to see the mountains one last time before her execution. It was a simple request, but it had a lot of meaning. It showed that even though she was cold and calculating, there was something in the mountains that touched a part of her that was maybe more human. The authorities talked about the request for a long time. There were obviously concerns about security, but there was also the understanding that this might have been the only humanitarian request she made since being captured. Finally, they agreed to let it happen, but only under strict conditions. She would be heavily guarded and taken to a high point with a view of the mountains, where she could spend an hour before going back to prison to wait for her execution. The trip happened on a clear morning in August. Abigail, chained but treated with the residual dignity reserved for convicts, was taken by cart to a promontory known locally as Eagle's Rest. The view from there went on for miles in every direction, showing off the Appalachian Mountains in all their wild beauty. Ridge after ridge rose up to the horizon, covered in thick forests that changed color as the clouds moved through the sky. Abigail didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked. The guards stayed a respectful distance away, giving her this last chance to connect with the place that had been her home for so long. Later, reports say that for the first time since she was captured, tears streamed down her face. These tears were not tears of regret for what she had done, but of grief for losing the mountains she loved more than anyone else. It was a show of emotion that proved she could feel deeply, even if it was only for landscapes and not for people. There was a deep silence in Abigail Hensley's last days in prison. She spent hours looking out the small window of her cell and watching the clouds move over the mountains in the distance. Some visitors came by to talk, some out of curiosity, and others to try to figure out the mysteries of such a different mind. She answered with the same polite behavior she had shown throughout the trial, always keeping that emotional distance that was so typical of her. The prison chaplain tried to give Abigail spiritual comfort, but she made it clear that she did not agree with him. She couldn't see or touch anything that wasn't part of the material world. Her philosophy was still firmly based on the cold pragmatism that had guided all her decisions. The chaplain would leave these talks feeling uneasy because the woman was so sure of her view of existence and didn't seem to be looking for any higher meaning. When fall came to the mountains and painted the slopes in gold and red, Abigail made one last simple request: to see the mountains one more time. The officials talked about it for a long time, but in the end they all agreed. She was taken to a high point with a lot of guards, where she could see for miles in every direction. For a long hour she stood there in silence, taking in the view of the world she had lived in for so long. The guards who were there said that was the only time they saw her cry. She wasn't crying because she was sorry or sad. She was crying because she felt a deep connection to that wild place she loved more than anything else. The mountains had been her friend, her home, and her territory. Now they were there to see her off. It showed that even though she was cold to people, she could feel something real for the landscape that had protected her. There was no drama in the last events. Abigail faced her fate with the same calmness she had shown since she was caught. When the time came, she walked with dignity. There were no dramatic last words or apologies. She just looked out the window at the mountains one more time and whispered something about how those old ridges would still be there long after everyone there had turned to dust. The authorities wrote about her death in a short, official way. There was no big ceremony when she was buried in a local cemetery under a simple tombstone. Newspapers wrote short articles about the case being closed, but people were already focused on other things. Abigail Hensley's name slowly faded from the public's mind, becoming just another dark story among the many that the mountains held. In the Appalachian communities, though, her memory lived on in a different way. On cold nights, people told stories about her that slowly turned her from a real person into an almost legendary figure. She became a symbol of the darkness that can be found in remote areas, and a warning about what happens when someone chooses to live completely outside the rules that keep societies together. Every time the stories were told again, they grew and changed, adding things that mixed fact and fiction. The places she had lived in over the years were either abandoned or destroyed. People in the area burned down the original cabin as a way to get rid of the stain it represented. The stone foundations stayed, though, and over time they were covered by plants, serving as silent reminders for those who knew where to look. The mountains took these places back, making them part of the landscape again, as if they had never seen anything bad happen there.